Shed Australia, thank you very much for coming here tonight. We're very, very glad to welcome Paul Collins, the author of Absolute Power, and Keneally, an eminent youth citizen, here to launch this book. When I looked at this book first, I remembered two comments my late father made, who grew up, in another world, and he reminded me of what happened when a friend of his was actually made a bishop, and he said that man will never ever have a badly cooked meal again and never ever hear the truth again. And I've always remembered that because I think that's the lesson of absolute power. And the other one was, we grew up near a seminary, and the saying of the students was, the road to hell is paved with the skulls of priests. And that is actually very central. Without being too black about it, it's actually important to remember. Paul. And then Krinstina, you'll actually say a few words, Krinstina.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for your interest in Paul's book, Papal Power. I was quite honoured when Paul asked me to launch this book because as a young theology student, as I was some 20 years ago, and having moved to Australia, at a time in 1995 when it was hard to find people who were talking publicly and theologically about reform in the church. Paul Collins was someone that I used to read and think, oh wow, maybe I can meet him one day. And it's been an absolute honor to get to know Paul and to understand his thinking and to share with him and with Marilyn a passion and a commitment to carrying on the reform of the church. Not reforming the reform, as Paul talks about in this book, but continuing the reform. I want to say a few things about this book. First of all, I loved it. It's always a nice thing when you can say that when you're launching a book. It reminded me why I'm a Catholic. Specifically, it reminded me that I'm a Catholic in the vein of Leo XIII. I'm grateful for Rerum Novarum. I'm grateful. In fact, I quoted Rerum Novarum to the Australian today. Not often, in the context of the Business Council of Australia. Not often you get to do that. They borrowed the phrase, just as an aside, the Business Council of Australia has set up a front group to campaign for corporate tax cuts. And they set up a website. Do you know what they called this website? For the common good. I said somewhere where Leo is rolling in his grave. I'm grateful for the Rerum Novarum. I'm wedded to the social justice tradition of the church. It also reminded me, before I get on, what else reminded me of, as we learn in this book, Leo XIII wasn't a raving reformer by any stretch of the imagination, but he was more willing than his predecessors, Pius IX, or his successor, Pius X, to engage with the contemporary world and to engage with some of the challenges that were confronting people, changes in technology, industry, and employment. I will say I'm not a papal scholar, though. That wasn't my area of theology. And there were times in this book where I sat, there was much in this book that I knew, and it reminded me that I had forgotten. And there were times that I sat up straight and said, oh my goodness. And in one of those moments was when it suddenly struck me, as it had never done before, that the church has made Pius X a saint, but it has not made Leo a saint. And I think, well, how can that possibly be? Well, it can possibly be because, Pius X encouraged us to go to communion every day, and Leo encouraged us to think. And, maybe there's the answer. It also reminded me that I'm, of course, a John the 23rd Catholic, and it kind of reminded me that I'm a post-Vatican II baby. Born in 1968, grew up with the expectation that the church was on this inexorable path of evolution, that it was moving towards progress along with the rest of society, that it was going to move just inevitably towards a more open, democratic, wider involvement of the laity, and particularly of women, that it was going to innovate and adapt to the modern world. That is the way that I grew up. So in some ways, though, this book did dismay me. And it didn't dismay me anything to do with the author, or his style, or his prose, or his conclusions. But rather, it dismayed me by the depressing realization that the very reason that I do love the Catholic Church and still profess to be Catholic actually represents a very brief period of history within the past 300 years. And what we really do have over the past 3 centuries is an increasing tendency to identify with the Pope with the Church and the Church with the Pope. And the reliance on hard power to enforce rules, to punish, to define, to demean, to delineate, to demolish dissent, and to preserve power for the few. The lack of any modern notions around things like transparency or governance or accountability or shared responsibility. The fact that some of our popes, perhaps like some of our political leaders, were depressingly flawed, either lacking in intellect, empathy, curiosity, or leadership capacity. This is depressing, especially when, again, another thing I learned, this phrase, power tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. I can't believe I didn't know this. Lord Acton actually wrote that in 1887 to an Anglican bishop in reference to the Renaissance popes. I've heard it quoted so often in politics. I'm now going to use this quite regularly and point out it's directed at the papacy. Paul does us a service, I think, by giving us a history to view the Pope and the Church through this lens of papal power. And he does it in a way that allows us to contemplate what are these two competing models of church. He talks about, and he quotes Lumen Gentium, very much in that sense that the first 2 chapters talk about the church as the people of God, as a communion, as a community gathered together by the Holy Spirit, where power comes from the bottom up. And then he points out to us that in chapter 3, it's as if those first 2 chapters never occurred. And chapter 3, suddenly we're confronted again with the Vatican I Church, the hierarchy, and the power, and the papal power, and the appeals to authority of the magisterium, and infallibility. And perhaps you reminded me as a student of Vatican II how much Lumen Gentium just really points to the whole tension that runs throughout the history of the church and that we're still experiencing today. And I think this one paragraph from Paul's book, the conventional argument is that these 2 models, hierarchy and community, are complementary, except in practice they are diametrically different ways of operating. Yes, this might just work if popes, bishops, priests always acted like Christ-like leaders, respecting the community. But they don't, and Catholics experience the disjunction between their internalized image of the Church as a participative community and their actual experience of the hierarchical and arbitrary institution. This has been very corrosive for the faith of a lot of Catholics. To me, this was the paragraph that really sang out of the entire book. And sang to me to the tension that I feel, the tension I think many Catholics feel, and the tension that exists still within our church today. Now, Paul leaves us with some areas for hope, and maybe he will talk about these more extensively, but things that I think a lot of us in this room will know that we could do in the church. We could extend the franchise for the election of the Pope beyond the College of Cardinals. We could extend who can sit in the College of Cardinals. We could look at the development of home churches or base communities. We could evolve decision-making, for example, in things like the interpretation of liturgy into the vernacular. Why is that being done at a central location by people who don't speak English? We could change our understanding of what ordination is. Is it lifelong? Is it celibacy? And what do ordained people, what function do they provide? We could, of course, in many ways expand the role of women, and we could shift to see the church as a communion of communions rather than as a top-down organization. I think when I said Paul has done us a service in providing this book, I think he's shown us the history of the church for the last 300 or so years. He hasn't, as some authors sometimes do, pounded us over the head with his interpretation of what it means. But his interpretation of what it means comes through at the end. And I think it's an invitation at the end, a gentle one, for the reader to come to ask themselves some questions. And I think the most striking question is the papacy as it has evolved over the past few centuries so corrupted that it's now heretical? That is it actually so far from the humility of Jesus that it's actually distracting from Jesus' message, from the gospel message? And in this, he cheekily quotes right at the end Martin Luther, Jesus is the test of everything. And if Jesus is the test of everything, you look at the papacy and say, where's Jesus in all of that? So this is the gift that Paul has given us and given to the church. Like many gifts given to the church, I doubt they will receive it well. By that I mean the institution and the hierarchy, not the people of God. I think the people of God will receive it well. I think the community of the church is desperately looking for leadership, is desperately looking for an answer as to who the church is in the context of the institutional sexual abuse of children, in the context of the lack of modernity, the failing of the vocations, and looking for the church to be a voice. And I think this is the point on which I'll end. What has constantly struck me over the past 2 decades, and particularly the last 5 years, as we've seen the unfolding of the institutional sexual abuse crisis and the church's complete failure, which, by the way, Paul does a very good job of explaining how badly John Paul II reacted to it, is the sense that the church, if it was capable of continuing on with the path that John the 23rd put us on in Vatican II, if it was capable of addressing some of these issues around governance and transparency and accountability and inclusion and incorporation of the laity into its structures and its decision-making, it would actually be able to exercise its soft power in the world far more effectively. And by that I mean to be a prophetic voice on issues like refugees, on economic inequality, on the environment, on the rights of indigenous people. These are all areas in which the church has a very prophetic message, and yet it's stifled and it's distrusted, and it's not able to exercise that because it's created all these stumbling blocks for itself. So, Paul, thank you for a book that I love, a book that dismayed me, and a book that still gives me hope, though, even throughout it all. Because as I said to my husband, I'm really depressed by this book because it says to me the church is not the church I think it is. It reminds me, he said, well, you're confusing the institution with the people of God. And I think that's the thing we always need to remember. What you've written about is the institution. Who we are is the people of God. And that's what troubled eyes. Thank you.
I want to thank Krinstina. I was walking yesterday and on trying to deal with my arthritis, and I thought the woman who is launching this book has run the largest government in the country. Now, I'm a Victorian, and I don't really, New South Wales is kind of missionary territory for me. Yes, but I mean, not only has she run the largest government in the country, but she's also the first woman Premier of New South Wales, which we rejoice in. And we rejoice to see another woman as Premier of New South Wales. That's very good. You're ahead of Victoria now. And, but on top of that, she's the first person with an advanced theology degree to be the Premier of New South Wales. There are one or two premiers who perhaps were not too skilled in theology, their predecessors. So Krinstina, thank you. I'm really in your debt. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that. How this title came about, councils of the Church are strange things. And at the First Vatican Council, it was a very strange council. It was held as Italy was gradually choking Rome. The Papal States were gone. Rome was all that the Pope had left. And they were to invade a couple of months after the council and the Italian forces. And some quite demented things happened at Vatican I. And one of the most demented was that the council defined papal primacy as the absolute fullness of supreme power. Now that's demented. I mean, even Stalin didn't have the absolute, I mean, we saw the death of Stalin recently, and I mean, it's close to the absolute fullness of supreme power, but there's a demented claim about that. And that led to a debate between myself and the editor in New York as to whether this book should be called Supreme Power or Absolute Power. So we opted for Absolute Power. And then of course, I'd forgotten about Lord Acton. And I mean, he's an interesting character, Acton. He was one of the lay leader of the opposition to the definition of infallibility at the First Vatican Council. He was an absolute polymath. He was the first editor of the Cambridge Modern History. He was professor of modern history at Cambridge. He was a born Catholic from a long way back. The Actons are an old recusant Catholic family in England. He's married to a German. He spoke perfect German, perfect Italian, English, French, Spanish. And exactly as Krinstina said, he was reviewing this book by Mantle Crichton, the Bishop of London, the Anglican Bishop of London, on the Renaissance popes. And that was when he said in this review that power tends, it's misquoted, most of you got it right, it's misquoted, power tends to corrupt, he says, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And in a way that would have been my secondary text if I put text as some authors do at the beginning. The interesting thing though is that occurs just, they define papal primacy in those terms just 70 years after the lowest point in papal history. Now I did a book on Europe in the 10th century, it was back in 2013, and I've looked at the 10th century popes, and really essentially they were mafia families that ran the papacy. And the papal influence never really extended much beyond a 100-kilometre radius around Rome. And I mean, that's the great thing about the past, because popes could claim everything. They could claim they were God on earth. But if you were a priest or a bishop or a peasant in Scotland, it was 3 years before you got the news. And by then, the silly old bugger in Rome would be dead, you see. So, and that was another great thing about the papacy. Pre-modern medicine killed you rather than cured you, so that was good. We got rid of them quicker. As Cardinal Newman says, it is an appalling thing for a pope to live too long. And he said it when Pius IX still had 20 years to run. Well, not quite 2015. And we have had a repetition of that from the gentleman who was elected in 1978. His predecessor lasted 28 days, and the gentleman who followed him lasted almost 28 years, 25, 20, 24, 23, 78 to 2005, whatever, work it out for yourselves. But that is the thing that is, that the papacy has come from rock bottom when Pius VI's body was left unburied by the French authorities in the citadel in Valence, and was left unburied for three or 4 months, and then he was buried in unconsecrated ground, very bad news in those days, to John Paul II, who travelled more than Queen Elizabeth II, and literally could draw crowds of millions. So we are, and the whole reason for that is Innocent III in 1215 could claim what he liked, but John Paul II could claim what he liked as well, and it was known to everybody, every bishop in the world next day because of modern communications. So this centralisation in some ways is essentially the result of modern communications, which is a kind of interest. It's nothing to do with theology, really. And so that's in a way kind of what the argument that I was trying to make in the book. This is the 4th book on the papacy. I've had it. Papal power, then papal power was my choice of a name, but then we got to Upon This Rock, which was Melbourne University, that was before Louise Adler. Melbourne University's choice of a name, which was terribly pious, and there's a number of critics commented, that Collins has got piety suddenly, to a book on another Melbourne University Press book, this time commissioned by Louise Adler, the famous person who commissions books like flies. This was on Benedict XVI, and they called it God's New Man, which is, I always thought, a very silly title, and it never sold very well, so don't worry. And now, Absolute Power. I think I've had enough power. I need a drink, and probably so do you.